Ladies and gentlemen, in this gaming.com video, we're going to be discussing the PlayStation 4's 7th CPU core. You might recall yesterday how we reported that there were rumours circulating that the 7th CPU core had been made available to games developers, and now, accordingly, it is indeed the case. It has been confirmed that the 7th CPU core is now fully unlocked, and developers are free to utilise some of its performance, and we'll get into some of the performance in just a second. So, first of all, if you're not too familiar with this situation, the report originated on Beyond 3D Forum, and then quickly migrated to other forums such as NeoGAF, where a user reported that a change had been made for Fmod audio middleware, and the changelog was very nondescript. It simply said PS4 added Fmod_thread_core 6 to allow access to the newly unlocked 7th CPU core. It wasn't very descriptive, it just gave you the very basic gist of what was going on, and that is, of course, the PlayStation 4's 7th core was available to run software on. In other words, it was no longer reserved just for OS functionality, which of course is a really big deal if you're a games developer. At the time, I even mentioned that I'm pretty damn certain, according to the fact that it isn't a changelog for Fmod, it's not something that someone has mentioned on a forum with no backup, no evidence. You know, it was just Bob, who knows someone who works at Sony, who happened to mention to him over a coffee that, hey, we're working on this. It was actually a changelog for a pretty reputable piece of software, and these changelogs are not produced for you and I, they're not produced for members of the press, they're not produced for gamers, they are produced for the folks over at Activision, they are produced for folks over at Ubisoft, they're produced over for folks who are actually creating software in the games and need to know this stuff. So the changelog is probably going to be pretty accurate. This would not been an oops, made a mistake. No, someone would get really badly in trouble for that. So to get back into this, Eurogamer have stated that they do have a source which has told them that yes, this is indeed the case. They were slightly ambiguous, and they didn't actually mention the reserve of the 7th core, which is available for gamers and for game developers, and we'll get into that in just a second. But what they did say is that it splits the activity on that core, the 7th core, between the user and the system. And this is according to the PlayStation 4's debugging and analysis tool known as Razor. So Razor, all it essentially does is it will look at a piece of code, whether it's a piece of code in isolation, whether it's a game running, whether it's, an aspect of a game, for example, let's say the particle engine, or let's say the AI, or let's say the physics, whatever it is, and say, hey, this is the amount of CPU time it's using, this is the amount of GPU time this is using, this is the amount of memory this is using, this is the amount of time that this thread is active, and so on and so forth. This is not specific to the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 4 has Razor. The Xbox has what is known as PIX, that is Performance Investigator for Xbox, where it does much the same thing. It will tell them the amount of ESRAM that's being used, the amount of GPU that's being used, and so on. And it does allow games developers to, of course, better optimize the code to run on that system, which is the whole purpose of it, right? So, getting back into the processing performance level, the unlocked 7th core of the Xbox One is, of course, one of the reasons that Sony have probably done this. I'm not saying it's the only reason. I have a feeling that it would have done this anyway, because as consoles age, developers will need more resources to make games look better. So really the only thing you can do is A, optimize your code, or B, the actual producer of the hardware, in this case of course it would be Sony, needs to do things to improve the efficiency of the system or give back more resources to developers. In the case of the Xbox One, what we know is that 50 to 80% of the 7th processing core is available to developers. Usually it's 80%, however, it's basically flexible. What I mean by that is that you can't just say, well, you know what, we're going to give you 80% of this core 100% of the time, because unfortunately that same core is is being used for other things, specifically Kinect related functionality. So for the sake of argument, if you say Xbox record that or something along those lines, the CPU usage of that 7th core spikes. Now, I have done a ridiculously in-depth analysis of the Xbox One SDK leak, which happened earlier this year. That was actually done by the hacking group, known as HALT. That would be H4LT. And they leaked the SDK of about a year old now. Remember, the SDK leak happened very early this year, but the actual leak itself, the software that was leaked, came from November 2014. In other words, it's a bit old, so we don't know what Microsoft have done in, say, the last year or so. But in the case of Sony, it does leave us wondering, well, what percentage of the CPU core is available to games developers? If I had to speculate, an educated guess, I guess you could call it, a guesstimate, it's probably around the same level. I'm going to assume it's not 100%. I don't think it's anywhere near 100%. It's probably around the 50% mark. Bear in mind that the PlayStation 4 does have overheads as well. This is not new. This is, you know, kind of like saying to you, well, you need air to breathe. The system has overheads. It has, if you press the PS button, what happens? Yep, that's right, you get the menu. There's no loading times there. It's instantaneous for the most part, you know, very brief latency. So yes, all of that is in system memory, that is in the background being processed. You do have drivers, you do have, of course, the network stack. If you're playing online for the sake of argument, you have to have drivers to run the network card or the Wi-Fi or whatever. That has to, of course, communicate with the PlayStation 4's, the PSN network and all of this other stuff. So there is operating system overheads which are running all of the time. That's why the developers originally, and I mean in this case Sony and Microsoft, originally cordoned off 2 of the 8 cores to developers and said, no, you can't access those, you've got 6 to work with. So essentially now developers are being given access to more performance. Do remember that this is not, unless developers decide to go ahead and make some patches to improve their performance or retrospectively improve their code, and as I improve in a loose term, because it's not improving it, because, you know, you're improving in the sense that you're expanding the code to run on more threads, but you're not improving it in that it wasn't broken to begin with. I just want to clarify. So in other words, unless, for the sake of argument, Naughty Dog want to go back and say, hey, we're going to release a patch for The Last of Us Remastered, which is going to give access to the 7th CPU core for that piece of software, it won't make a blind bit of bloody difference, because essentially it doesn't have access. The software is not programmed to take advantage of those resources. However, for games which are currently in creation, so I don't mean games which are very near completion or just about to be released. So for the sake of argument, as I'm recording this, Rainbow Six, which is just about to be released, this probably won't make a difference. But for games which are going to pop out, say, next year, let's say June, July next year, then yeah, that certainly will probably play a small role in the development of the game. They'll probably say, oh, okay, so now we've got more resources, we can do X, Y, and Z. CPU resources in particular are always helpful, because the CPU naturally gives instructions to the GPU as well as other components in the system, and will run, let's say for the sake of argument, artificial intelligence. It will also do some stuff on physics. In the case of the PlayStation 4, it's always been very, I would say, GPU balanced. What I mean by that is the CPU in the machine isn't crap, but it's not up to the same caliber as the amount of GPU performance. So why basically this happened is that when Sony were putting together the system, and this is even comments from Mark Cerny, I'm paraphrasing, but you can pretty much read between the lines, he envisaged this scenario where the PlayStation 4's GPU was going to be doing a lot of the compute work, so it's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, simply because of the massive parallelism that the system's GPU can do, which of course is what they made some of the changes towards the actual GPU for, For example, the fact that they put in that volatile bit so that they can more easily just delete certain pieces of code which are related to compute if it's in the level 2 cache, so that they of course also added in further asynchronous compute engines so that it can more easily run asynchronous code on the GPU and not interfere with graphics jobs. And while all of that is certainly great, and is great for, let's say, cloth simulation, or is great for physics or lighting or whatever they happen to be doing, unfortunately it can't always happen. And as I mentioned in yesterday's video, there are situations where the PlayStation 4's CPU has certainly been obviously a limitation in comparison to the Xbox One. For example, there were some who were wondering, including myself, this was before the PlayStation 4's, the Xbox One's 7th CPU core news was available, and everyone was just kind of thinking, well, the Xbox One CPU is running at 1.75 and the PlayStation 4's is running at 1.6, and that's all we knew. But what we noticed when we're doing analysis of the games, for example, GTA, when we were doing whatever game, it doesn't really matter, there were situations where the PlayStation 4 was behind the Xbox One, whereas others where the Xbox One was behind the PlayStation 4. Now, behind the PlayStation 4 is fine, we can understand that. The PlayStation 4 has a GPU advantage, that's fine. It runs at 1.3 teraflops roughly for the Xbox One. The PlayStation 4 runs at 1.84, rounding up both of them. There is a slight subtle difference. The Xbox One's is 1.31, and I think the PlayStation 4's is like 1.843 or something like that, but just rounding them up for sake of argument. In this case, this was not happening. The Xbox One's games were running at a slightly higher frame rate, and it was like, well, why is that? I mean, sure, once again, if it's in GTA 5, there are certain sections where GTA 5 on the Xbox One did look worse than the PlayStation 4. Essentially, it had less vegetation. We've got a video up on the channel which does demonstrate this. We looked at exactly the same areas, and there was noticeably less vegetation on the Xbox One version. Fine. We can 100% get behind the Xbox One matching the PlayStation 4's performance in that case, because the GPU has less stuff to draw. However, this was not the case all of the time, and the Xbox One, particularly in high traffic sections, the Xbox One was definitely beating the PlayStation 4, and the same thing could also be said for Assassin's Creed Unity. Unity was an absolute bitch on both systems, but the PlayStation 4 went all the way down to 17 frames a second during heavy crowds, whereas the Xbox One, it was certainly not exactly damn playable, but it was around the low 20s, let's say 21, 22, 23, which, when you're dealing with 17 compared to 22, you're not exactly happy with 22, but believe me, it's a massive difference. It's absolutely profound, and it makes you beg for every 1 frame a second you can get. So obviously, we found out that the reason behind that is because Microsoft probably, well, the most probable reason behind that is because of the 7th core on the Xbox One. Now, this is no longer the case. The PlayStation 4 does have that extra core. How much of that core is available for? We know it's 5% of the PlayStation 4's 7th core. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying splits the activity on that core between the user and the system is not really anything. It's like, well, 1% technically is splitting, but it's going to be around the 20% minimum, I would guess, but it's probably going to be around the 50% mark if I had to take a guess, because otherwise it probably wouldn't be worth developers actually putting the time and resources into using that CPU unless they were creating a game from the ground up specifically just for the PlayStation 4, in which case maybe. But then you've got other things like thread contention, you've got a whole bunch of other stuff which you might actually lose performance as you'll start to actually switch those threads out. So there is definitely that thing to consider as well. So it's probably at least about 50% of the CPU time on the 7th core if I had to take a guess. The Xbox One still will have an advantage unless the PlayStation 4's CPU usage is around 90% all of the time, simply because the Xbox One CPU is clocked at a higher speed. It's 150 MHz advantage. Not exactly massive. Remember, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One are using exactly the same type of CPU. It would be the AMD Jaguar. It's basically a low power it's basically the low power CPU. It was meant primarily for, let's say, tablets or low power notebooks, those type of devices. But the fact that Sony have doubled the amount of processors as per normal, so they've got 2 of the Jaguar modules inside the system. Same thing for Microsoft. This is, of course, the reason that the systems are able to produce that much more CPU power. Anyway, unfortunately, we don't have any further details, but at least this clears up the fact that it is, you know, happened. It has happened. Unless, of course, Sony go out and actually confirm it further. To be honest with you, I would if I was Sony at this point. It doesn't benefit them not to. They might as well just come out and say, yeah, we've done this. However, as we all know in gaming, it's one of the most secretive industries out there. It's like, I'm pretty sure that I could physically have a copy of the poster of the next Assassin's Creed, for sake of argument. I could have their source code, you know, I could have the developers, you know, I could walk into the office, take photos of all of the games being produced. I could take photos of their, you know, their product, their showcases, their concept art. I could tell them, you know, everything, and I could put a video out with that, and they would still say, no, actually, we're not working on that. It's just how the industry is. But anyway, of course, I was maybe being just ever so slightly silly with those last comments, but you get the idea. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.